History is unfolding before our very eyes as Syria is heating up. And what starts there may rapidly reach Israel's doorstep. Folks, most people won't see it coming until it's too late. And the most dangerous part is that Turkey is right in the middle of it. Buckle up, everyone, because we are watching another aggressive move in the Middle East that could change everything as we know it. All right, folks, let's get into it. I was busy browsing around, just kind of casually looking at the news, and when I saw this headline, I was jarred a little bit. Let me read it because I thought it was wrong, but it isn't. It says this: Damascus orders troops to prepare for operations against U.S.-trained SDF. Okay, there is so much to unpack with this title. There is so much to be said, but folks, this has everything to do with Turkey. This has everything to do with Julani. I refuse to call him by his new name. Once a terrorist, always a terrorist, but this is huge and it has big implications. So let's start in with the reading here. It says this. It says Syria's government has asked factions within the military to prepare for operations against the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, SOHR, reported on Monday. According to SOHR, Turkish-aligned factions in the Syrian army were asked to prepare for operations against the SDF in Deir Hafar and the Tishra'in Dam area. SOHR added that officials in Damascus have requested that a campaign against the SDF not take more than a week. Okay, folks, this is a big deal. Because as I have said before, and I'll make myself very, very clear, I have said that when we witnessed what happened with Bashar al-Assad, when we witnessed everything that took place with al-Julani and Hayat Tahrir al-Shem, which was the terrorist organization that he led, I said this was a power play by Turkey. I said this was the beginning of what Erdogan believes to be the resurrecting of the Ottoman Empire, which in essence speaks more of a very specific caliphate that he believes himself to be the leader of, and that becomes consequential for a lot of different reasons. We'll get into it in just a second. Look what it goes on to say. It says the operation would aim to pressure the Kurdish group into accepting the agreement signed with Damascus in March this year. Recent days have seen a significant buildup of both Syrian army forces and SDF troops in eastern Aleppo, which, by the way, you should expect to see that happen. If you saw movements like this begin to take place, if you see tensions rising, if you see such orders being issued from Damascus at the hand of the Turks, of course, this is going to escalate. Of course, it's going to get super heated in the north. You would expect this to be the case. Look what the article goes on to say. It says on Monday, SOHR reported escalating clashes in eastern Aleppo. More than 10 artillery shells struck areas around the Tishra'in Dam following exchanges between the SDF and Turkish-backed Syrian factions, which, by the way, you would expect that the Turkish-backed Syrian factions would be alive and well, especially with the dissolving of the PKK. None of that stuff should be a surprise to anybody because we saw all of this happening ahead of time as we were beginning to watch the politics begin to change dramatically, especially as it relates to the relationship that Erdogan has had with Israel and everybody else that surrounds that area. Even Lebanon becomes affected by all of this for a lot of very important reasons. Earlier in the day, SOHR sources confirmed that orders were issued to deploy show-of-force units with heavy vehicles, tanks, and artillery to the Deir Hafar front line in anticipation of possible SDF operations. There are also reports that the SDF has stationed kamikaze drones, rocket launchers, and long-range artillery near the local sugar factory, which, by the way, you would expect that to be the case, especially as it relates to some of the positions that they have to defend, and why they would end up going to that area or resolving to that tactic is probably because it centers around the fact that that's all that they have. And there's some big complications involved with the Kurds, but all of this is going to have much more significant consequence than just the story I'm reading, and I'll get into it in just a second. Look at what the article goes on to say. It says military reinforcements from Turkey also arrived at the Kaddis airport, while the Aleppo-Raqqa road in Deir Hafar remained closed for a third consecutive day. Additional forces from both the SDF and Turkish-backed Syrian units have gathered around the Tishra'in Dam, heightening concerns over an escalation. Yeah, they're building up forces, folks. They're getting ready for a major confrontation, and I think it's almost hilarious. And yes, I'm being sarcastic in the utilization of that terminology. I think it's hilarious that this is all on the heels of the president of the United States meeting with Erdogan. I think there's a reason behind all of this, and there might be a silent nod involved in all of this. I kind of doubt it to a degree, especially because of the relationship that the SDF has had with the United States of America. But on the other hand, this may be a part of the long game attempt that the president is making to completely dismantle everything that related to the Arab Spring. And of course, we know that this is Obama's policy being completely dismantled as we're beginning to see the SDF in a position of vulnerability, and the vulnerability that they're in being allowed to happen by the United States of America. SOHR added that an SDF drone strike destroyed 2 positions of Turkish-backed Syrian factions in Kashla village on Sunday. There has been tension between the SDF and the government over a deal signed in March calling for the Kurdish group's integration into Damascus's forces. The two sides disagree about the deal's implementation. Particularly, the SDF wishes to remain under Kurdish command and enter the army as a bloc rather than dissolve and conscript, which, by the way, that's a reasonable position for the Kurds to have and a reasonable position for the SDF to have. Why? Because they are concerned that Damascus will turn on them, and they are concerned about sort of a mini genocide. And I hate using that term, but you have to keep in mind, when you look at Hayat Tahrir al-Shem, which is in essence Damascus right now as we speak, they are not trustworthy within the context of how they deal with the Kurds. And of course, it's in the best interest of Turkey to actually see that begin to diminish as a result of the building up of forces. They want to see the destruction of the infrastructure represented by the SDF, especially with the Kurds, be completely broken out and removed. Look what it goes on to say. It says skirmishes between the SDF and the Syrian army have broken out several times since last month. Well, of course they've broken out several times since last month. When you see them repositioning, when you see them and their actions in or around Aleppo, and when you begin to see them moving further north, you should expect to see this type of reaction to take place. Now we're getting into a discussion with respect to Turkey in this next paragraph, but this even makes a lot of sense. Look what it says. Ankara's proxy, the Syrian National Army, the SNA, which, by the way, oftentimes is conflated with the SDF. They're completely different people, right? Okay, so I had to stop to explain that to you. Let me go back and read the sentence again. It says, Ankara's proxy, the Syrian National Army coalition, was incorporated into Syria's military after the fall of former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government last year. These Turkish-backed forces have been at odds with the SDF for years and are responsible for war crimes against Kurdish civilians in northern Syria. Yes, that is absolutely true. And this is where the integration of the PKK and the YPG and all of that stuff began to come to a literal head, especially during the time of the Arab Spring. And of course, it's fitting with this next line. It makes a lot of sense. It says the SDF is made up predominantly of People's Protection Units, that's YPG forces, and the YPG is the Syrian branch of Turkey's enemy, the Kurdish Workers' Party, which is also known as the PKK, which of course the PKK recently disbanded. And by the way, what makes this particularly egregious to me is the fact that Julani is being worshipped by people right now. And it's very twisted. It's very weird because he's a terrorist. It's crazy to think about what's actually happening here. As a matter of fact, let me show you a video of Petraeus literally worshiping the ground that Julani stands on at the UNGA. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Let me show you this video real quick.
How are you holding up under all this pressure? Are you getting time to do some thinking? Are you getting enough sleep at night? Again, I've been there, and it is so very, very hard. And your many fans, and I am one of them, we do have worries.
I don't know about you folks, but when I see that video, it makes me sick to my stomach. It is a former American military person literally bowing at the feet of a terrorist. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, guys, Petraeus was the former director of the CIA. There's just so much to say about that. But you know what? I don't have time for that. Let's move on. This last paragraph, by the way, is going to take into account what El-Julani is saying concerning Turkish movement. Look what it says here. It says the Turkish army, which occupies Syria and has operated against the SDF in the past, may be gearing up for a new campaign. Okay, so this is what they call him al-Shara is saying right now. Very interesting. Look what it goes on to say. Here's another quote from Julani. Look what he says. Turkey may act militarily if full integration is not achieved by December. Give me a break. He's pretending about all this. There is so much nonsense tied to this, but it's a whole other story. In late May, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan warned the SDF to quit stalling and integrate with the Syrian army. Turkey is currently training Syria's new extremist-dominated military, and the National reported on August 17th that Damascus is assembling a force of 50,000 to capture Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa from the SDF, which, by the way, is very likely and it's very possible. Now, what does all of this mean? And why is all of this significant, especially with respect to all of the things that we're talking about? Folks, there are a lot of things to consider here. And these are the things that can happen pretty quickly, okay? First of all, it has a dramatic effect on the Golan Heights, okay? And the Druze, okay? Assad is gone. You have Julani that's in the picture. And he is, of course, the self-appointed government leader who leans heavily on Turkey. So any action that he is threatening right now is being done at the hand of Turkey, and that's going to affect a lot of things. It's going to gravely compromise the position of Israel in the Golan Heights, especially the Druze. The Druze in southern Syria now face a completely different power dynamic. You guys have to understand that. Instead of balancing Assad with Iran, they're now under pressure from the Turkish-backed Syrian factions to do whatever they want them to do with the central authority that Turkey brings up. This is something that's very important to understand. This is all being controlled by Turkey. Now, this likely is going to weaken the autonomy that the Druze have on the Syrian side. And, of course, Turkey has little incentive to let them maintain any kind of independent channels with Israel. So they're going to attack the capability of the Druze to continue maintaining communication with Israel, which weakens Israel's position, especially on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. It puts them in a position to more effectively attack Israel if they so choose to do so. You guys have to keep in mind that this is extremely dangerous for Israel. Why? Because the Druze have historically been a very stabilizing local presence along this area where the Golan Heights are. If Ankara, I'm talking about Turkey here, chooses to align themselves with Damascus to put a squeeze on them, then that local buffer is gone. Israel now has another front that they have to defend themselves on. Turkey's growing presence is getting very, 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 very close to the Golan Heights, and that is going to give Iran very indirect pathways to come back in. That could strengthen the position of Hezbollah that's almost completely eliminated in southern Lebanon, but quite frankly, it could strengthen and go back to a place that's very dangerous. These are the implications that we see. Now, of course, this is really interesting because when you start looking at the effects that this is going to have on NATO, and especially considering the fact that the largest military in NATO besides the United States of America is Turkey, this is going to create some big, big issues, especially if Turkey continues to warm their ties with Russia. And by the way, when I say they warm their ties with Russia, I'm talking about what they do with energy, arms, and of course, diplomacy. They've got big diplomacy with Russia, and of course, they're continuing to trade energy and arms, okay? Russia doesn't need any kind of official support from Syria anymore because Syria becomes the playground for the existence of Turkey, and Russia's now working with Turkey, okay? That's a very interesting effect that it could have, and interestingly enough, as Turkey continues to colonize Syria, Russia walks right back in with the control that they've always wanted, or at least with the influence that they've always wanted, bypassing NATO and putting NATO in big danger because the biggest military in NATO is now coalescing, working with Russia. That's a big deal. Now, this could mean something very different for Turkey because of the F-35 promises that were made within this recent set of meetings that the president had. I would have to think that somehow, some way, the president is very aware of the Kurdish allies that exist in the region. They have to be aware of Turkey's intent to do this, and maybe they're secretly nodding off. I don't know. Who knows what's going on? But what I can tell you is there is somewhat a likely path, and that path is probably some type of a conditional green light where Washington quietly allows Ankara to suppress the SDF and in essence consolidate Syria, which would create more stability in the region while pretty much saying, if you do it the way we want you to do it, then we'll give you the F-35s. That could be a big possibility, okay? Now, what that means is this. That means we may have a consequential open door into the condition of Ezekiel 38. Now, the problem that I have with that centers around with the growing aggression by Turkey, especially in Syria. How do you create the condition of peace that we know is necessary per Ezekiel 38 in order to serve the prerequisite for the attack that's coming? That's the answer that I don't have. And that's the question that I continue to ask. But I'm telling you right now, there are more volatile issues that could be sitting on the northern front here. You've got the Druze completely squeezed. You've got the Kurds that are sidelined. You've got the Turkish-aligned militias that are now entrenched. And now Iran is slipping back under Turkish cover. That's a big problem. Does that open the door for the type of attack that we read about in Ezekiel 38? Yes. But how does the peace process come into play with that? America could be the answer. It could be the answer. And it could be that America is going to retreat from this area, which, of course, could signal the continued decline of any kind of Western influence that we're seeing in the region. That's very likely what's happening here, which could also go to describe why America becomes inconsequential in Bible prophecy. No matter how you cut it, things seem to be coming together for the scenario that we're reading about in Ezekiel 38, and it's very interesting. I'm not surprised about Turkey's movement in this. I'm not surprised about what's happening in Syria, and I'm certainly not surprised about where Israel is. What I do think this is going to do is I think it's going to dramatically change Israel's standing with the world, because as Israel begins to see this forming, they are probably going to get a whole lot more aggressive with Gaza because they understand the necessity to secure that area while potentially facing their most vulnerable place, and that is, of course, going to be along the Golan Heights. Remember, they cannot afford for Iran to go back to a place of activation. They certainly cannot afford for Iraq to turn on them the way that they think it could possibly turn, especially with the existence of the conflict that happens with the Kurds that kind of keep order, and of course the potential or the problems that may come with the Druze. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and there's a lot of stuff that could change very dramatically, and that's why we've got to be aware of all these things. That's why we got to keep our eyes open. We've got to pay attention to what's going on and understand that Christ could come at any moment. All of these things, every single thing that's necessary for Christ to come has already happened. So let's keep our eyes open, let's keep our heads up, and let's pay attention to this very important detail. And that is, again, we are running out of time. So more than ever, let's bring people the hope of the gospel, and let's do it while we emphasize Bible prophecy, because we know that this stuff is materializing before us. It's that simple. So learn this. Develop an understanding for what's going on. Prepare yourself for the dynamic that is beginning to develop, and get out there and fight the good fight.